Now, what do I mean by too little, too late? Well, I'm going to look at a couple growing nationalist thinkers in China. Right, we're going to look at a couple of growing nationalist figures in China. And these are people who represent how the Qing, through their constant failure to reform and to protect China against foreigners, have lost credibility. Right? How many wars do the Qing have to lose before you give up on them? Right? They've lost 2 opium wars. They've lost the Sino-Japanese War. They darn near got overthrown by the Taiping if the Westerners had not intervened. So by this time, many Chinese people, especially after 1894-95, start saying, we don't care about the Qing anymore. These guys are losers. They're not protecting China. And their ideas, because the Qing are failing to protect China, are going to be very influential. Now, one of the people who's coming up with these ideas is a man named Zou Rong. Zou Rong, and we're going to see this is important later, is educated in Japan. So he goes to Japan and is able to learn how the Japanese are doing things. He's able to gain exposure to modern ideas because Japan is modernizing. And one thing that's very important, it's not particularly hard for Chinese people to learn to read Japanese. Japanese use a lot of Chinese characters when they write. So Japanese people are also able to write in Chinese easily, and vice versa. Chinese people are able to learn to read Japanese also very easily. And just to give you an example of this, I had a Japanese-American friend of mine who was very good at what Japanese call kanji, that is Chinese characters. And we could watch Chinese movies that didn't have English subtitles, but had Chinese subtitles, and he could tell us what was going on based on his ability to read those Chinese characters. Even though he didn't know all the grammar, he could understand what was going on. So a lot of Chinese are attracted to Japan. It's right next to China. They're also Asian, and it's relatively easy to learn to read Japanese. And he becomes convinced while he's in Japan that the Manchus need to be overthrown to make a strong China. Right? Like I said, these guys from the Chinese perspective are losers. They are continuously losing. They are failing to protect China from foreigners. They're failing to keep order and so forth. And he's going to put down his idea in a work called the Revolutionary Army, which we'll look at momentarily. This work is so bad, so critical of the Manchus, that he will be thrown in prison for 2 years. The Manchus would have killed him if they could, but he was in a foreign concession. He was in a part of China controlled by foreigners, which is kind of ironic because he was criticizing the Manchu for failing to protect the Chinese from foreigners, but he was relying on foreign protection because the Qing were too weak. But he's thrown in jail for 2 years. He would have been thrown in jail, or rather executed, if the Qing could have gotten a hold of him, but he was in this foreign area. However, unfortunately for Zhou, he will die in prison at the age of 19. He basically gets sick and dies. And in some ways, Zhou is very interesting because he sounds a lot like a modern political thinker. And at first, a lot of his ideas, I think, when you listen to him, you say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. For example, he argued that all people, including women, have rights. Those rights should be protected by the government. And all people, men and women, should help choose their governments. So he believed in democracy. He believed in liberalism. And he thought all people need to actively serve the state. People should actively serve the state by willingly paying their taxes. That's kind of traditional. But also by being willing to serve as soldiers, which is not as traditional. So he believed in nationalism. Right? So you have clearly here this young, educated Chinese man who is saying that the Qing are no good, the Manchus are no good. We need to rebuild a new China based on the principles of democracy and nationalism. And as I said, I think that's things that most of you listening would be fine with. This you're probably not so fine with. These are quotes from Zou Rong's Revolutionary Army. Let us overthrow the barbaric government established by the Manchu people in Beijing. Okay, it's maybe not nice to call government barbaric, but okay, we'll call it that. Let's drive out the Manchus who live in China or kill them to take revenge. Oh, goodness. Wow. So we need to kick the Manchus out of China, and if they won't leave, we need to kill them. Why? Vengeance. 3. Let's kill the emperor set up by the Manchus in order to assure that in perpetuity there will never be another despotic monarch. Wow. Okay. So this is some serious stuff. And you can understand why the Manchus wanted to arrest this guy. But this is what this has come to, right? It's this very strong nationalism focused on ethnicity, on race, that says that these Manchus are really bad and we need to, in a sense, drive them out, purify our land from their influence. Right? That's basically Zou Rong's understanding of how things need to be done. And to show you how radical things are becoming, we have this interesting figure named Qiu Jin. Qiu Jin was a feminist and a nationalist, right? And I just want to emphasize this. We've talked about some powerful women before who were politically active, but they typically have to be monarchs, and they typically have power because the men in their lives. So, for example, Myeong-sung had her power because she was married to the Korean king. Qixi had her power because she had been the consort, mother, and aunt of these emperors. But Qiu Jin is one of these women who is going to wield power based on herself as an individual. And as I said, she's kind of got her own radical ideas. She's a feminist and a nationalist. She is in a marriage to a man she doesn't love, so she will leave him, flee to Japan, and study there in 1903. So she'll end up spending like 3 years studying in Japan, learning modern ideas and so forth. What's interesting, while she's in Japan, she will sometimes dress like not only like a Westerner, but like a Western man, right? So she'll engage in this kind of cross-dressing. And this seems to be an attempt to argue that women could be politically active, right? To basically, in a sense, by cross-dressing, she's trying to blur the line between men and women and between men's roles and women's roles to argue that women should also be active socially and in politics, right? That seems to be the argument she's trying to make. In addition, one thing she does is she unbinds her feet. And I think that's one reason why she's going to switch to Western men's dress. So in China, traditionally, women who could afford to, in a sense, or rather who I should say their families could afford to, they would have their daughters' feet bound. They would wrap the girls' feet into with bandages to basically make them very small, right? So they would because this was considered erotic, basically, to have girls who would grow up into women with very small feet. And the problem is, if of course you can imagine this would be very painful. This actually broke the arch of the woman's foot and folded her toes under the rest of her foot, so this is terribly painful. It also meant it was difficult for middle and upper class women who had this done to actually walk, right? They certainly couldn't move fast. And she actually unbound her feet, right, when she adopted this Western men's dress. And she criticizes foot binding in a journal that she helps to edit. And part of this is, again, this attempt to say, hey, women can be politically active too, and how can we be active at all, politically or otherwise, when we have to have these tiny feet that are basically broken, in a sense. And also, while she's in Japan, she will join a revolutionary group, and she will write articles calling for revolution and for transformations, not only in terms of political transformations, but in social transformations, arguing that women should have more rights and should be subjected to things like foot binding. Now, unfortunately, in a sense for her, because she's politically active, she will become involved, of course, in politics in China. She will be principal of a girls' school, but she will also take part in a plot to try and basically assassinate a Manchu governor, right? They want to assassinate a Manchu governor and then lead an uprising to overthrow the Manchu. That plot gets found out, and in the end, she is executed. Now, the influence of Zou Rong and Qiu Jin was limited because both of them unfortunately died, right? Zou Rong from disease brought about by his imprisonment, and Qiu Jin because she actually tried to participate in an actual rebellion. A man who had an unbelievable ability to survive the many attempts by the Qing to kill him was a man named Sun Yat-sen. Sun is a fascinating character. He started off as someone who wanted to reform the Qing, but because the Qing refused to engage in serious reform, he decided he needed to overthrow the Qing. And he was really early in deciding to do this. He had decided this even before the Sino-Japanese War, that the Qing needed to be overthrown. He was also a convert to Christianity. And as I mentioned before in this class, we need to understand that Christianity was not simply a set of doctrines to be believed, though of course the Christians certainly believe that, but it was also understood as being connected to a broader kind of civilization. So by becoming a Christian and wearing Western clothing, as you can see there with his wife, Sun was committing himself also to democracy and nationalism. He essentially, in particular, wants to make China look like the United States. And that makes a lot of sense, right? He wants to get rid of overthrow the Qing, he wants to form a large, and that China is a big country, the United States is a big country. And the United States, being a big country, is still able to govern itself through democracy, so Sun is going to look more towards the United States. So he also is an important exile leader. He'll spend very little time in China. He will spend most of his time outside of China organizing people to resist the Qing, right? The organization he actually establishes in Japan, that's the one that Qiu Jin joined. So he's really good at organizing Chinese, especially overseas, and those overseas Chinese can go back to China and influence China. He's also very good at fundraising. If you want to have a revolution, you got to have money. And he was great at getting people to open their wallets, reach into their pockets, and give money that he could use to then organize a revolution. And he also had a vision of what China should look like. He will establish a party, what's called the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang in Chinese, in order to help bring that vision together. So you've got someone who's good at organizing, who's good at raising funds, and in a sense knows what needs to be done. So he is going to be very good at attracting followers. And in particular, his vision is very simple. He is going to call for nationalism. China should be ruled by Chinese. Democracy. The people should have a role in how China is ruled. And something that's a little tricky, it's called people's livelihood. Basically, he wanted to industrialize China. He wanted to make China strong economically. But he didn't want to have the same problems that you had in the West. So he thought that there would need to be some socialism to protect Chinese people and make sure that they could have a basic living. In a sense, he wanted to address the problem of making sure that farmers didn't starve, because it's absurd for people to grow food to starve. But that kind of thing happened in China. Now, he's going to be constantly attempting to overthrow the Qing dynasty. If it's easy to lose track, but I believe he launched 11 separate attempts to overthrow the Qing dynasty, all of which failed. But despite that, the guy was a survivor. As much as the Qing wanted to, they could not get rid of this man. So let's return then. Why are there problems with Qing reform? Why do these reforms fail and eventually lead to the downfall of the Qing dynasty? Well, first of all, as we mentioned before, the Qing in reforming have turned away from their base. Right? Their traditional base were the Confucian scholars and the gentry, who accepted the Qing because they supported Confucianism. But now they've turned away from Confucianism, they've gotten rid of the exams. So the Confucian scholars and gentry are now alienated from the dynasty. They don't see any reason to support the Qing because the Qing no longer support them. In addition, the Qing, by establishing these elections, by accepting a constitution, even though it hasn't been implemented yet, are shifting from how they try to legitimate their rule. In the past, they legitimated their rule through the mandate of heaven. Now they're shifting to something like democracy. And this brings up a question that Chinese people could ask themselves. Why should the Manchu rule? They weren't elected. Right? Why should the Manchu rule? They weren't elected. We didn't elect them. In the past, if you said, why should the Manchu rule? The answer would be the mandate of heaven. And you could do the traditional test to see if they had the mandate of heaven. But even people who believe that would say, well, things aren't going well. The Qing are not doing a good job. But if you start believing in democracy, you're like, we never elected these guys. Their rule is illegitimate. And as I just mentioned, they're really doing a lousy job. They're not doing a good job at all. How many times do we have to lose to stay with these guys? If they have to rely on us Chinese to fix things for them, why shouldn't we just be in charge, right? Similarly, as we saw with the case of Qiu Jin and Zou Rong, nationalism is growing. And Chinese are saying, you know what? Chinese should be ruling Chinese. Right? Chinese should be ruling Chinese. We don't want these Manchus to be ruling us. Right? We don't want these Manchus to be ruling us. We Chinese need to rule Chinese. And you can't satisfy them. Right? Zou Rong and Qiu Jin are not going to be satisfied by any reforms. Sun Yat-sen is not going to be fundamentally satisfied by any reforms because now they've become convinced that Chinese should rule Chinese. They're now all nationalists. So the old Confucian scholars, the gentry, people like Zheng Guofan from the past who would have supported the Qing because the Qing supported that old Confucian tradition, they're no longer willing to support the Qing. In fact, they don't have much power. Instead, more and more Chinese are becoming more nationalistic and saying, we don't want the Qing ruling us. Chinese should rule Chinese. And so fundamentally then, this is too little too late. Had the Qing done this in perhaps the 1870s, after the failure in the Taiping Rebellion, they maybe would have had a chance. But they've just had too many failures since then. The Chinese just are too nationalistic and say, we could do a better job. We don't want these guys telling us what to do anymore. There's no point. The Qing government then is pretty rotten by this time, right? They don't really seem to have any good ideas. There's no longer a capable politician such as Xi in charge. In a sense, it only seems like a matter of time. Especially because nationalist and Republican ideas of democracy, are spreading. Students are coming back from Japan, and they're spreading those ideas, either through contacts in the army, or because they joined the army themselves. Remember how I emphasized how the Qing were serious about modernizing their army at this point? So the army, instead of being like a center of traditionalism and conservatism, is actually one of the most modern sectors of the Chinese government, of the Qing government. And so there's a lot of army officers who believe in nationalism and in the republic. And a lot of those people will be, like I said, students who came from Japan or influenced by them. So all throughout the army, you have a growing number of soldiers and officers who are saying, we don't want the Qing to be ruling us. That's not a good thing to have in your army, right? That's not a good thing to have in your army. In addition, the Qing are going to try and gain control over railroads. People in the provinces were trying to build railroads, right? Chinese people in the provinces were trying to build railroads because they thought they were a good idea. But remember how I said the Qing tried to gain central control over the railroads? They'll basically start taking over people's railroads. And the people don't like that. They were building the railroad just fine. Thank you very much. We don't want the Qing coming in and taking over our railroad. So you've got this very volatile situation. So you've got Chinese people actually fighting with the Qing, with these basically these kind of riots and these fights over railroads as the Qing try and gain power over the railroads. So you've got this volatile situation, right? You've got Chinese who are resisting the Qing attempts to take over local railroads. And then in Wuzhong, there will be a group of students and other revolutionaries who will meet in order to make bombs, right? We have a volatile situation. We have conflict. They think that if they just push things a little bit, then the Qing can be overthrown. And they get together and have a bomb-making party. So you got these revolutionaries together in Wuzhong making bombs together. And one thing I should stress, if you're going to make bombs, you should not smoke. Do not smoke while making bombs. It is a terrible idea. Do not do that. What happened was, in this apartment, it would seem that one of the students or revolutionaries, some ash from their cigarette fell into the explosives and set off like a chain reaction, which blew up the kitchen they were in, killing them, and also, of course, attracting attention from the authorities. Because, what are you going to do when the apartment next to you blows up? You're going to call the police, you're going to call the firemen, and so forth. Fire department. And what happened then was they came to investigate, and they discovered that they had actually had membership lists. They actually had a list of the members of their secret organization dedicated to overthrowing the government. So, this is another rule. If you're forming a revolutionary group, do not keep a membership list of all the people who are a part of your group, which you could be killed for being a part of. And if you do keep that list, do not allow the government to find it. So the revolutionaries realize, oh geez, the revolutionaries who are not killed in the bomb-making explosion realize we need to act now. If we wait, the government's just going to come and arrest us. We need to act now. We need to act promptly in order to deal with this situation. So they are going to start their revolution. And remember, the army has a lot of supporters of the revolution. So essentially, the army will rise up and revolt. And that's what you can see in that picture there. Right? In that picture on the right, those are members of the new army who support the revolution fighting against forces loyal to the Qing. And you can see, I've tried to make a big deal about how people are dressed because it does show their politics. Notice those are new army soldiers. They are dressed in what were considered modern military uniforms for the time. So now we have a revolution. Right? It kind of happens by accident. There's this kind of context of struggle over the railroads, and then there's this bomb plot, or I should say bomb, the accidental explosion, and then that activates all these soldiers in particular, as well as students who are in the army. Very quickly, there will be elections, even while this war is going on, in which Sun Yat-sen will be elected president. Right? So Sun Yat-sen will be elected president. What's funny is he found out that he was president when he opened the newspaper one day in Denver, like in the United States. He's in Denver, Colorado, in the United States. He opens up the newspaper and finds out he's president of China. So he will get on a boat and very quickly return to China. Now, what ends up happening, though, is the war goes fairly well for the revolutionaries, but at a certain point it becomes a stalemate, and everyone is afraid. Both the people who are for the revolution and against the revolution, if they keep fighting, foreigners will intervene and carve up China. Right? There's this fundamental fear that that's what's going to happen. And so that is going to lead to actual compromise, where the last Qing emperor, who was just a little kid, he's like 4 or 5 years old, will abdicate and will cease governing China in exchange for basically being given a lot of money and being allowed to live in the palace. Right? So they instead of, remember, Zou Rong wanted to kill the last emperor, wanted to kill the Qing emperor and make him the last emperor. That's not going to happen. Instead, there will be a compromise, primarily out of fear of foreign intervention, in which the Qing emperor is allowed to keep some power, or not really keep power, but is allowed to be given a lot of money and live in a palace. In exchange, he abdicates. And so it looks like in 1912, we've got a nice, healthy republic established. Right? 1912, it looks like we have a nice republic in which you have a clear president, Sun Yat-sen, longtime revolutionary. Looks like China's on the way to democracy. Now, one thing I should point out, though, that's very fascinating, this is the territory claimed by the Republic of China. You'll see it looks very similar, with the exception of Mongolia, to what the People's Republic of China looks like today. One thing I think that is fascinating about it is that you'll notice it includes Manchuria. So, in a sense, the Chinese wanted to kick out the Manchus and say Chinese people should rule Chinese people, but then they wanted to keep Manchuria. In fairness, the vast majority of people living in Manchuria by this time were Han Chinese. Remember, Han is the majority ethnic group. But also they claimed Tibet and Mongolia and Xinjiang, what's labeled there as Tian Shan. And I think that's interesting because those people are not Han Chinese. So there's this very interesting thing about Chinese identity, is it's understood in modern times that Manchus, Tibetans, Mongols, because there are Mongols who live in the Republic of China, or I'm sorry, in the People's Republic of China today. They're just not part of Mongolia. They live outside Mongolia. They're all understood to be Chinese. So it's this very weird situation in a sense where the Chinese recognizes that there's lots of different ethnic groups who are Chinese, but the Han Chinese are the most Chinese, so they get to be in charge, basically. That's the basic situation. And because otherwise you've got this really weird kind of logical problem, because if the Chinese want to be independent because Chinese should be ruling Chinese, then Mongolians and Tibetans would also logically be independent because they're a different ethnic group. But the Chinese argued, well, they're Chinese, but they're so we all need to stick together. But when it came to actually allocating power, the Han Chinese get to be in charge, in part because they form 95% of the population. But I have to point out, there's kind of a slippery use of the term Chinese, is that we sometimes use it to refer to Han Chinese only, but from the perspective here, sometimes it's used to refer to all people living in China, even if they're not ethnically Han. It's very complex. Now, unfortunately, being a historian, whenever I end on a hopeful note, you know immediately that I'm going to dash those hopes. So there are some problems, right? There's some problems that are going to plague this republic and stop it from holding China together. China's going to fall apart. Why does that happen? A lot of it has to do with the military and with the people who command the military. There was, you may recall this guy, Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was that Chinese official who was sent to be China's representative in Korea and basically kind of try and govern Korea almost like an informal colony of China. Well, he's still around. By this time period, he was a high official and he had his own army, basically. Right? He had his own army in the provinces. It was very important because it was called the Beiyang Army, and that means the Northern Army, so it controlled the capital. And he was a very powerful official, and he was so powerful that the Qing government decided that he should no longer be a high official with his own army, so he was retired because of an injured leg. His leg wasn't hurt. He was informed by the Qing, Basically, he read the newspaper, similar to Sun Yat-sen, you could say, and it said, oh, Yuan Shikai has retired from his offices because of his injured leg. In fact, his leg was not injured. This was just a kind of face-saving way to get rid of the guy, right? Because the Qing Empire feared him, thought he might try and revolt and overthrow them. Remember, we talked about this earlier. There was always this fear that the Qing government had of its own army, and that's a problem. Here's the other problem. Many soldiers were still personally loyal to him. Right, so many people, even though they put someone else in charge of the army that he had been in charge of, a lot of the soldiers didn't care. Their loyalty was to him, not to the Qing dynasty. So they didn't care. They didn't care who the Qing appointed. They were loyal to him. To make things even worse, the Qing are going to call for his help when the revolution breaks out. Right? So this is the problem, right? They kind of said, oh, this guy, he's too dangerous. Uh-oh, we need him because the soldiers are loyal to him and he's a competent official. We need this guy. So when revolution breaks out, they're going to call him for help and he'll say, I'm sorry, I can't help you guys. My leg still hurts. In the end, then, he will throw his support behind the revolution. And that's a big deal because he still effectively has an army. He's going to be one that negotiates the abdication of the last Qing emperor. And so he will be the one that actually holds the power. And he wants it. He does not support the revolution because he's anti-Qing in particular. He does not believe in democracy in particular. He just wants power, and he knows he can get it. In fact, what will happen is Sun realizes that this is the man with the power. Sun Yat-sen, remember, he's the guy that's elected president. He will actually resign the presidency so that Yuan Shikai can become president. He does that because he realizes that if he doesn't, Yuan Shikai is going to fight with him, probably overthrow him using his army. It would be much better instead to just go ahead and give Yuan Shikai power and then try and keep China together. Right? The big fear here is that if this revolution continues, if the civil war continues, that will lead to foreign intervention. In the end, then, like I said, Sun will resign his presidency, but he gets Yuan Shikai to promise to move the capital to Nanjing. Right? That's the old capital of the Ming Dynasty. It means southern capital. And that Yuan Shikai will respect democracy. One reason I should point out Sun Yat-sen wanted to move down to Nanjing was that Sun Yat-sen supporters tend to be from southern China. Yuan Shikai's supporters tend to be from northern China. So moving him down to Nanjing would put him closer to Sun Yat-sen supporters and farther from his Yuan Shikai supporters. So there was a kind of practical reason why Sun Yat-sen wanted to do that. However, even though Sun will promise to move the capital to Nanjing and promise to respect democracy, he will do neither. He wants power himself. He wants to govern China himself. Now, elections will still go ahead and go through. A parliament will be elected in 1913. It will try to rein in Yuan. It will try and make sure that Yuan will behave in accordance with constitutional and democratic limits and traditions. However, this will fail because Yuan will assassinate people who get in his way. He will assassinate, for example, a good an ally of Sun Yat-sen, Song Jiaoran, who is a very successful politician. He seems to be a threat to Yuan, so Yuan will just have him killed. And he will also engage in censorship. He will even outlaw the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. So he wants to make sure he's in charge. He's not interested in actually having a republic. He's interested in dictatorship. And he's still basically committed to self-strengthening. He is not interested in carrying out really these reforms that we talked about that made the West so powerful, particularly democracy. He's really against that. He's all for nationalism. He's Chinese, after all. He's Han Chinese. But he is not interested in supporting a republic or democracy or anything like that. So in many ways, he kind of is harking back to the old self-strengthening ideas. And you can kind of see his attitude. There he is, dressed as a soldier. Now, he will establish Confucianism as a state religion. So again, you can kind of see in some ways he's like a self-strengthener, but a little bit more so, but not really interested in radical reform, right? He says, okay, modern powerful countries have state religions like Meiji Japan. We need a state religion too. But that's fairly conservative, right? So the new republic is going to be facing some problems because essentially its president is not someone who's interested in radical reform and in fact doesn't even believe in democracy. I think the one thing worse than having a dictator is having an incompetent dictator. And I think if Yuan Shikai knew what was going to happen, he never would have taken the job, right? He would just let Sun be president. Now, what's going to happen is in 1914, World War I will begin. And France, Britain, Germany, Russia, these traditional, in a sense, opponents of China are going to be busy. And you might think, oh, that's good, right? All these countries that were trying to beat up on China, now they're busy. That's great for China. The problem is one country that was not busy with World War I, though it was involved, it was only had limited involvement, we'll talk more about it later, was Japan. And Japan said, good deal. Now that those Western countries are gone, we can expand our influence in China. So in 1915, Japan will issue 21 demands. And this is really striking. This isn't diplomatic language at all. Japan just says, here's our demands. You Chinese need to do them. And I'm not going to go through all 21 of them, but basically they would have given Japanese economic privileges in China. China would have to purchase Japanese military supplies. And China would have to accept Japanese advisors. Remember what happened to Korea when it accepted Japanese advisors. That's right, Korea became a colony. Right? The Resident General of Korea, for example, Ito Hirobumi, that was one step towards becoming a colony. So if China gives into this, this is really bad. Now, what was funny was Japan issued these 21 demands and they said, oh, Yuan Shikai, please keep this secret. And Yuan Shikai was totally not going to keep this secret. He told the European countries, he told the United States, and Japan was forced to back off on the issue of Japanese advisors, but China still had to accept a lot of these. In 1916, Yuan Shikai will do something like Emperor Gojong, but this turns out to be a really, really bad decision. He will try and declare himself emperor. Right? He just decides, you know what China needs? We need to go back to having an emperor. And the people will accept me because I'm a Han Chinese, not one of those Manchus. This fails utterly. Right? This fails utterly. Very few people support this. Right? The only people who want an emperor back are the people who want a Qing emperor back. In fact, a lot of people will oppose this move. So rather than making China stronger, it leads many Chinese to shake their heads and say, this Yuan Shikai guy is nuts. We don't want to have anything to do with this reactionary. And others say, we need to get rid of this guy. Some provinces of China will actually secede from his government. Some provinces will say, we are not a part of this guy's government. We're going to establish a new government for China. And there will even be an attempt by the people who are still loyal to the Qing, there's some of them, not a huge number, but they're still there, to actually restore the Qing dynasty. And then Yuan dies. Right? So he lives long enough just to really mess things up, and then he dies. China will fall into chaos then, with generals and warlords seizing local power. And so here's the big problem. Chinese people do not agree what China should be. There is still division in China over what China should be. Moreover, it's not clear who can hold it together. There is, in a sense, no figure now with anything like the power that Yuan Shikai wielded. Did have his own army, right? He wielded a great deal of power. There's no one, though, who can hold it together like he could. He did a bad job of it. So there's this basic question. What should China be? And now, who can hold China together? This marks a good point in our class to kind of step back for a moment. When we started this class, there was an East Asian order that maintained stability and peace to a large degree. China, Japan, and Korea had, for a very long time, enjoyed peace between each other. However, that old order that maintained peace and stability in East Asia is going to fall apart when confronted with aggressive Western imperialism. And China, Japan, and Korea, which had all been independent, functioning countries, are going to have very different fates, as we have seen. And the question is, why? Right? Why did Japan become an empire, Korea become a colony, and China fall into chaos? Now, there are lots of reasons for why these things happened, but I'm going to mention just some that I think are important in terms of comparison, right? Remember, this class focuses on comparisons. Japan does the best, right? Japan not only maintains its independence, but becomes an empire. Japan was very fortunate, and it had the focus of legitimacy and nation in an emperor, who was Japanese, right? The Japanese had a Japanese emperor who could serve as a focus for the legitimacy of the nation and a focus for their nationalism, and they could unify around this person, Moreover, they were fortunate in that the people who brought that emperor to power, who restored him to power in their words, were from a social class that was willing to support that emperor and rally around radical reform. So Japan thus had a government that was able to unify the country, in a large part because they had a Japanese emperor who had not, because he'd been kept out of power for so long, was not connected in a sense to that old Tokugawa shogunate order that had failed so poorly in many ways. It had not been able to resist Perry. And they could rally around this old, pure, ancient symbol of Japan and build a modern nation state around him. And he was fortunate that you had this class of people, these lower samurai, who were willing to support him and engage in radical reform because they were no longer, they didn't win under the old system, so they were willing to make a new system. Poor Korea, in contrast, could not maintain the old diplomacy that had maintained security. Right? Korea was able to was a strong enough independent state between China and Japan that the Chinese and Japanese were not particularly worried about it being a security threat. But with the aggressive Western imperialism, Korea suddenly becomes a security threat, and both countries want to make sure that Korea is under their influence. That means a loss of independence for poor Korea. Now, the Koreans did try and reform. These reforms were limited, right? Because remember, even when Emperor Gojong was willing to undertake reforms, he did so as an autocrat. He did not favor democracy. He had crushed democracy. And so he was not willing to himself to follow Japan's road, which had worked. But one thing I want to point out, I always feel bad for Korea because I'm not sure if Korea could have survived this. Even if Koreans would have played their hand very differently, I'm not sure if Korea could have maintained its independence. In China, in some ways, they could have been like Japan, but they have a problem. They're ruled by a different ethnic group. Right? The Manchu were not the same ethnic group as the majority Han. And therefore, they were unable to link up with a pro-reform social class like the Japanese did until it was far too late. Right? Remember, the Japanese emperor being Japanese and the social class being Japanese that were interested in radical reform were willing to work together because reform promised to help them both. It promised to make a powerful nation for them to govern. But the Qing, because they were a different ethnic group, were very much afraid that if they changed things, they adopted nationalism, democracy, and that would hurt them. That would hurt their power. And they could have changed things. I think especially in the 1870s and 80s, they could have set up something like a constitutional monarchy. They would have given some power to the Han Chinese. They chose not to. They thought that the self-strengthening was enough. And so in the Qing, because there's this ethnic difference and because the Qing wait too long to be able to reform and they have too many failures then, the Han decide we want to go it alone. Right? We don't want these Manchus. We don't really get anything by being ruled by these Manchus. We want to go it our own. And so this the Chinese imperial system will fall apart. I think it would have been fascinating what would have happened if China had been ruled by Chinese emperors. Things could have been very different, but they weren't. They were ruled by the Manchu Qing.